guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I made this awesome looking gecko cake. The best part is this structure you can use for any sort of character you want to recreate. I'm going to show you step by step how I made it. Let's go. Okay, let's talk about eyes. I love to use isomalt to create the eyes in my cake projects. So for this gecko, I'm going to be doing the same. He does have a wide area and then the iris. So I'm going to be using a couple of things to accomplish that look. I'm going to be using printed iris on a edible printed sheet, icing sheet. I got this from my local cake supply store, and I bought these images out of one of the stores on Etsy that had some PJ Masks theme downloadables. And so I have my irises there. I'm also going to use Simi Cakes ready to use isomalt, which is super easy to use. It's already cooked. You don't have to worry about having to use the correct temperature to make it. These you just pop in the microwave following the instructions and you have your isomalt ready to use. And I'm not being paid for this mention. It's just that I really love her products, and I think she delivers to most places, including Puerto Rico. She's located in Melbourne, Florida. So if you want to give it a try, if you're first time using isomalt, get yourself some ready to use isomalt. And then I also have from Simi Cakes a mold that I believe is from the Liz Merrick line. This is like a dragon eye mold. I just have one, but I'm gonna use it because it looks very similar, and even though it has a little bit of an egg shape, I can always rework it with some modeling chocolate on our cake. So let's start on our eyes and get that going. All right, so I wanted to show you how the eyes turned out. This is how, once we have torched and gotten rid of all those bubbles and added edible glaze to the eye, this is how it looks like. And I love, you can see that shine in the eyeball. So after I torched them, I went ahead and let them cool, and I used an edible glaze. This one is PME. You can use whichever brand you want to use, but make sure you always seal your isomalt, because isomalt can be damaged by the environment. So whether it's water, air, humidity, all of that can get into it, and you want to make sure you seal it so that they stay nice and shiny. Otherwise it will cloud on you and it's not going to look pretty. So again, torch them, let them cool down completely, glaze them up front and back, and then they will be ready to use. Now let's move on to our cake structure. Step by step, I'm going to guide you on how to create the body of gecko in this particular case. Okay, so I realize I'm cut off, but you're not here for me, you're here for the cake. No, it's hard to get like a nice angle, and I do want you guys to see everything. So I have here a board This is, I believe a 12-inch cake boards are there. You can use any wooden board you like. I often go to Home Depot and just grab the big, I wish I had one to show you right now, but I don't. They are like $6, sometimes $10, depending on what you are, the size that you're looking for. But I learned of these boards through this Merrick, and I just love them. Nicely coated, they already have elevation, which is what we call feet, so people can put their hands under. And this is important, the feet in this case, because we are going to use, this is called a flange, and we're going to use some screws. So we're going to screw our flanges onto our board. So basically, you do need those feet, that little elevation. Otherwise, you're gonna come through the board. The screws we're gonna use, I wish I had some, and actually I think I do. I'll show you this as an example. So I don't know if you can see clearly, but those are the 3 bolts or screws, sorry, I keep saying bolts. This is leaking because I just washed it. I had something else on it. But see, they do make a mark, but they don't come all the way through. So they're small screws, as you can see, but very important because this is what's going to keep your cake stable. We're putting a lot of cake and a lot of other things into the board. It's important to have it very well stabilized. So again, a flange, some screws that we're going to do. And of course, for this particular board or cake, it's different because we have our little gecko that a little toy that my son had, and based on this is what I am going to make the cake. I have taken some measurements and I've decided that I'm going to make my cake 5 times this size. So the way I went about that was I took a ruler and I measured. In my case, I went a little backwards. So I took the irises for the edible images that I printed out for the eyes, and I just saw how big they were, and in comparison to these, they were 5 times bigger. So that gave me my scale of knowing that every measurement I take on this toy, I'm gonna multiply for 5, and I'm gonna get my final measurement for my cake. And so based on that, we're gonna talk about a little bit of the steps first on how to actually come about creating a structure, just so that you can replicate this with any other kind of cake. You don't have to just make gecko. I feel like I have to go down so you guys can see me. You don't have to make necessarily gecko, but you can make other ones. I did make a catboy for my son's birthday last year. I did not record that. I was down the wire, and recording takes a long time, so it's probably gonna take me twice as long to make this cake, but I wanted to show you guys how I go about it. That's another important point. You have to allocate a lot of time because it does take a lot of time. When people, I think one of the most common questions people ask me is like, how long did it take you? A long time, a long time. And I've been doing this for a bit now, and it still takes a long time. So let's focus in what we need. So flanges with the screws, and we are going to build up his legs with PVC pipe. So you are going to not only need PVC pipes, but you are also going to need PVC cutters. These are sold on, like, I got mine at Home Depot. This was like $10, and it opens like that, and then it clamps and it cuts the PVC, no problem. So you're gonna need that. Why? Because you're gonna have all these pieces of PVC that you're going to put, and so once we have these in place, sorry about that horrible noise. So once we have these in place, based on our structure and how we want it to look, we're gonna add a male adapter, which is gonna screw into this. So this screws right here. And of course, this will be nice and secure and on your board. And then this goes in, and you're gonna take your measurements. Let me see what my ruler is. It'd be nice to do this. And so let's say I come here and I say, okay, well, the legs, in my case, it's gonna be a little bit different. I'll show you in the video. I do want it to look like it's kneeling. And if you go to my Instagram page, you will see I made a Naruto cake that it is kneeling. So it's a little bit challenging, but it's not impossible to do. And so I would take the measurement up to the knee on the toy, multiply it by 5, because that's my scale, and then do the same thing here. I wouldn't recommend taking just a measurement with the PVC pipe, because as you can see, there's a little bit of takeaway from, or adding in, I should say, from the flange itself, the actual male adapter, and then the PVC pipe. So you would measure the whole thing, so you don't end up with excess. after the fact. And so then I would come in with a 90-degree angle adapter and put it in there, and then it'll look like the knee. And then we'll put in another little piece of PVC pipe, and then we'll add another either 90-degree angle or a 45-degree angle, again based on what you want to do. And what else? We will, once we have the whole structure, we will build it up with Rice Krispie treats. We'll make the body, we'll sculpt it, because of course you have to sculpt out of the Rice Krispie treat to get the shape that you want to do, and we should have fun. Again, I've been doing this for a little bit. If you have any questions, put them down below in the comments section. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as time permits, and I will try my best to give you all the tools and all the information that you need to make your cakes successful. Yeah, let's do it. So guys, here I have my board and my flanges. I am measuring the distance that I want to have between the 2 feet. And of course I have my little figurine nearby to take the measurements. As I mentioned before, I am doing a 1:5 scale. So any measurement I take on my little toy, I'm going to multiply for 5 and translate that measurement into the actual cake. In here, I am using 2 types of screws only because the boards are nicely coated, the ones that I'm using. And so I needed to pre-make a hole with a little pointier screw so that I can then utilize my actual screw and make sure that everything is nice and secure. And in this particular project, you're going to notice that I actually ended up having to adjust my design later on, because initially I wanted to have Gekko making that pose where his arms are flexed and his legs are a little bit bent, but my client, and by client I mean my 4-year-old son, came home and said, no, I don't like that pose. I think I want it to look just like the toy. And I am to please, so I changed it later on, but I think it's great because then you guys get to see what I do when I have to adjust a design, and it's something that you might run into, not because your client necessarily changes their mind, which I will also not recommend you to do. If you have a design, everything is agreed on, and you have signed a contract, do not allow anyone to change your design. But if in creating your cake you come across a problem that you foresee, or you see something that's not working for you, it's important to have in your contract also a clause that says that anything that you do to the cake is to make sure that is structurally sound, and so changes are, bound to happen. So in essence, what I'm doing here, as you can see, is taking my PVC pipe. I have my PVC pipe cutters, and I am taking measurements and basically aligning everything that I have taken measures on the toy and putting them onto my actual PVC pipe, taking into account the flange, the male adapter, and then I'm going back once I'm happy with how it looks and taking a glue gun that has high heat and gluing everything in place. So again, be very mindful, once things are glued in place, that's it. There's no turning back and changing anything. I like to reinforce around the connections after everything's been put in place, because again, we just want to make sure that everything is nice and sturdy before we start completing the rest of our project. Once the base and sort of like the leg area of my cake is done, or the structure, I then take a measurement for the body, and I added a T connector at the top, which is where our arms are gonna come out of, and then the extra PVC that we're gonna have to secure the head on. And I promise everything's gonna make sense once you see everything together. I am not going into much detail about the measurements here, because your cake will look different than mine. Your cake will not have the same measurements as mine unless you have the exact same toy and you want to make the exact same cake size. So again, the way you do it, you go to your reference, whether that's a toy, whether that's a picture, and you try to scale it based on your needs. In this particular case, I brought this cake for my son's class. They didn't have a lot of kids, so I ended up using I think it was 3 6-inch round cakes, and I just made the head cake. In my particular projects, I like to simplify things as much as I can when it comes to structure. And again, the more you practice, the more easy this will come to you. But I think that it's not impossible to add cake to the body. It's just a little bit of a more higher skill, because then you have to start, securing that cake, making sure everything is stable enough, and you might not end up with a moist cake. I wouldn't recommend that either, because then everything's going to start falling apart. So again, things to take into consideration, but for this particular project, we'll focus on making just the head be out of cake. Again, I'm showing you here and there some of the measurements that I'm taking, but it will all depend on what you're using as a reference. So this will be the body, and again, trust your measurements. I could have told you if I had gone by just looking at the toy, oh, this torso is way too small, but that's why our eyes deceive us sometimes, and it's so important to have a reference and measure your reference. Again, the arms are going to look slightly different at this point, because I had initially intended to have Gekko have that pose where his arms are flexed and kind of like knees bent. But the good thing about this particular structure is the PVC pipe. You notice there I did cut into the PVC pipe. Sorry to cut into saying this, just because I cut into the PVC pipe because it was too large. So these are 1/2 inch PVC pipe, and I just realized they were too long for what I needed them. So my measurements, I just had to adjust. So I did not only cut the PVC 45-degree angle, but also cut the T, so it allowed me to have a little bit of more wiggle room. You have to think I'm adding, whether that's cake or whether that's Rice Krispie treats or whether that's fondant or modeling chocolate. You have to take that into account too, so that your scale and proportions look adequate. And so back to what I was saying. This particular project allowed me to change the shape of the arms, because what I used for PVC was just up until the point of the shoulders. And you're soon going to see here that the arms themselves, I'd utilize a wire, 1/8 wire, and that way it allowed me to change the position where I had initially, like I said, intended to have it flexing the arms. But all I had to do was just turn the wire down and have it. Actually ended up having one extended with sort of like holding a candle, and the other one just down. Again, just taking measurements, cutting, making sure my measurements are on point. And you can see here, now we're starting to see a little bit of how that body armor, if you will, it's looking like. Reinforcing with some more glue. This is a high heat gun, and I am using Gorilla Glue. They have their own brand. I like it. I think it's sturdy enough. I never feel uncomfortable or scared that the cake's not gonna hold up. And structure is very important, because once you build up your cake and the structure is there and done, there's no getting it out and trying to fix things. So in here, I'm adding a piece of wire for the tail. This is the very connection point of where the legs will potentially meet, that crotch area, if you will. And I am putting just a wire. Again, I took a little measurement, made sure it was the length of the tail, and of course added a little more so that it could go around the PVC pipe and kind of like twist it onto itself. And then I reinforced it with some of that glue, let it dry, and you will be good to go. And in a minute, you'll see we're going to cover all of this with aluminum foil tape, not to only make sure that it's food safe, but also it'll help our material to stick to it a lot better. Now I'm working on the arms, and again, this will be based on your measurements, however long you need them. and I am folding the wire so that I can then glue that inside of the PVC pipe, and that alongside the actual aluminum foil tape is going to help it stay in place. We're not putting too much weight on this. Actually making mine out of modeling chocolate. I'm covering this entire cake in modeling chocolate. I prefer it. It's not impossible to do it out of fondant though. If you want to do fondant, you just have to be mindful of where your seams are going to be, in which case I would probably do the sides for the clothing. Gekko has a lot of lines because he has that reptile looking pajama for the cartoons. So it would be very, very easy to hide any seams. And I am just, in this case, making sure that glue dries inside the PVC pipe so that wire is nice and secure. And again, the aluminum foil tape will do the rest and help us make sure that that stays in place. And here I'm taking some of that aluminum foil tape I was telling you about and covering the flanges, which by the way, I made sure all of this was nice and clean. Hot water, soapy water, and what I typically do is I either take a napkin and go over everything once, and then I let them soak in nice hot soapy water. And that goes for the flanges, that goes for the PVC pipes, anything you can, because again, this is coming from a hardware store most likely, and they don't really care about dust. But this is stuff that is used for our water pipes, and so it's meant to be used for things that we consume. Again, this piece, particularly the body, the legs, the shoulders, everything's going to be covered by Rice Krispie treats. Typically nobody eats that in my experience. It is edible. I use the Liz Merrick recipe, which has chocolate in the Rice Krispie treats. It allows for a more stronger recipe and a more a stronger structure. So can people eat it? Yes. Is it gonna be as delicious as the regular Rice Krispie treats? No. So typically it's just like part of the cake, but it's not gonna be consumed. Nonetheless, I don't ever place anything that is not edible in my cakes. I try to be transparent with the clients. If I ever have someone ask me for something, always make sure to tell them what is edible, what do you recommend, how to keep everybody safe, because of course everybody wants to enjoy the cake. But obviously sometimes if someone were to tell me, hey, can we eat the Rice Krispie treats, which I'm putting right here, I would probably just tell them you may, but it's not going to be as delicious. The whole idea is that the highlight of this particular cake for me is the cake on the head for Gekko. As you can see, after I covered the entire structure with aluminum foil tape, I went ahead and added just marshmallow alone. This is something again that I learned from Liz Merrick. You want to add a little bit of marshmallow to all that structure so that the Rice Krispie treats has something to cling on to. The Rice Krispie treats, of course, have marshmallow, but it has less of it that it's going to be attached to your structure because it's now taking care of keeping all those Rice Krispie treats together. And the chocolate's going to help it harden a lot better, and also it's going to keep it nice and sturdy, but adding a little bit to the structure, it just is a little extra element that will make your cake successful. I think you can see here already that I had taken a piece of the legs off. I just took my regular food only saw that I have. It's a little handheld saw, and I cut that PVC on the sides, that parallel to where the tail is on the sides, because again, my client, my son, didn't want it flexing or scooting down, so I am taking the Rice Krispie treats and using that as a modeling element, and allowing myself to create a visual illusion of this is a straight up leg. And at this point, I do end up cutting a little bit more because it was just too much and I didn't want to make the body too wide. I wanted to stay true to my scale. So what I did was just adjust, and the structure was still sound because, again, this is PVC. It's really hard plastic. It's not going anywhere. At this point, it was nice and hard. So what I did was essentially think about the 90-degree angle that we put there, where think about the hip structure would be. I just cut it in an angle so the rest of the PVC pipe was still holding on to something. So it was an adjustment that I wanted to make. This was my cake, so I didn't have that pressure of like, oh my god, this is for a client. I want to make sure that it's obviously successful and nothing happens, but this was a great practice. So it lasted not only for one cake, I'll show you later on. I made this cake twice. So I had the same structure, I just stripped it, all of the chocolate, and of course I added new chocolate to the body and a new cake on the top. But it was a-okay with me cutting at an angle, at the 90-degree angle in the legs. I continue to add Rice Krispie treats as needed. Now I am building up some of the space that I will need for Gekko's feet. I am again making sure that I come close to my scale measurement, but not too much, because not to perfection, I should say, because you're gonna have, in my case, modeling chocolate added on. So remember that it's on, and you want to make sure you don't get too big quickly. I always try to add a little bit more Rice Krispie treats, however, because at the point where we are done completing and adding our Rice Krispie treats, we will let this all dry, preferably overnight. And what you want to do is have a little extra so you have room for carving. So once everything's nice and dry and everything is hard and into place, you want to come back with a knife and carve everything. Again, just looking at your reference, making sure things make sense, that measurements look okay. When you do carve out a little less than your actual measurement so that you have room for the added chocolate. I'm adding in the back. Gekko has sort of like a, there are cartoons that are children, so they have this really cute, short torso. I'm adding for the tail as well. Again, not to size, because you will have that added chocolate or fondant, if you decide to use fondant, to be added on to it. And then we want to grab some plastic wrap and make sure you're wrapping everything around. For this particular case, my Rice Krispie treats weren't as wet, but I still like to wrap it to make sure that things stay nice and strong. The Rice Krispie treats tend to pull away while they're drying, and that's normal because you have that hot marshmallow or chocolate if you're using the same recipe as I am. So you always want to make sure that it's nice and tight so that when it dries, it stays in place. Now I'm using some foam cord to create the base for our head. That is what's going to be supporting our cake. And so again, I took a measurement of the base of the toy and traced it onto my foam cord. And I am taking an X-Acto knife and going around it. This step takes a little bit of time, but this is so worth it, because if you just use a regular cardboard, cake cardboard, it's not, I really don't recommend it. You have a lot of cake, you have a lot of buttercream movement. If by any chance it gets a little wet, it might bend on you, so more structure is always better. Now, I took a little piece of PVC pipe and I am tracing a circle And this first try, I did notice that I went a little too back onto my foam board, and I did end up redoing it. So go right in the middle. Go right in the middle of the head. Gekko, this particular cartoon has a very round, very tall, very symmetrical head. So I noticed that my cake was going to be, it wasn't going to look proportioned. And also I noticed that the face was coming away from the chest too much. So I cut a new piece, made the hole right in the middle. You can see there, that's a newer piece, and it's right in the middle. And again, don't worry about the fuzzies that are around, because we are going to cover all of this with some aluminum foil tape to make it food safe, and also to make sure that no moisture from the cake gets in there. Make sure you redo the hole, and it'll work just fine with supporting our cake. The next day, my structure was nice and dry. The Rice Krispie trees stayed in place. And you can see here now I have my hands down, or rather the structure hands down. And you can see there in that particular area where I had caught the knees, if you will, where the knees would have been for the cake. And I'm just going to take my knife and go around and shape it the way I want it. Nice and smooth if you can get it. Again, using modeling chocolate, it's a little easier because using modeling chocolate, you don't have to worry about the seams, and it kind of spreads. And if you are short on something, let's say for example the chocolate goes into a crevice of the Rice Krispie treats, you can always add a little more. With fondant, it's a little different. If you're using fondant for this particular project, this step is crucial for you. You have to make sure that Rice Krispie treat is nice and flush. It's nice and smooth. And you also want to probably take the step of adding ganache on it to make it purely smooth. So you would take any holes, any crevices, any imperfections that were probably left, so that your fondant touches as smooth of a surface as possible. Real quick here, I am adding some cuts at the bottom of the feet because I do have that flange in there, which means I'm going to have to create the illusion of a floor, meaning where the cake is standing. So you don't want to create the foot all the way to the board so that then your covering of the board looks like the cake is stepping inside the floor, if that makes sense. You want to make it look the floor all one level and that the cake is standing on top of it. So to do that, just cut around the Rice Krispie treats that are going to be around that flange, and that's going to help you create that illusion that Gekko or any other character is standing on the actual floor. I'm just taking the time, looking at my reference, making sure things look flush. My feet look a little weird here, and I did notice that. So you're going to see that in a bit. I'm coming back with my saw and cutting that side of the leg a little further. And again, it's totally fine. In my case, as I mentioned before, nobody was going to eat this piece of the cake, and nobody was going to touch it. So I did cut through it, and then everything was going to be covered. So again, you know your work, you know what you're doing. Obviously, if it was an edible piece where there was actual cake, I would not recommend cutting it, because you don't want any pieces of plastic touching any piece or any part of the cake that it's going to be consumed. Always give yourself, I know I talked about timing at the beginning of the video. I think one of the things that most people ask me most often is, how long did it take you? And people, I know they get curious, because if anyone knows anything about art and how things look and how the details are created in not only cakes, but any sort of like detailing work, it takes time. This cake altogether, with the different steps that need to be taken from the design, my scale, determining how I'm going to create the structure in paper, baking, putting everything in place, It took 3 days altogether. And when I say 3 days, I mean 3 long days. Real quick, you can see here I took my saw and went back and cut a little bit, because towards the end it was looking a little too sharp. So and you saw how I grabbed that top of the cake and I just cut right through it. I mean, this structure is sturdy. You should not have any issues with your structure faulting you if you follow suit and make sure you glue everything with high heat glue. And again, yes, make yourself give yourself enough time to do this cake. This is not an overnight cake. This is not a 2-day cake. It's a 3-day cake with a plan already created prior to starting actually working on it. In here, I'm taking an upper hand on covering the bottom part of the cake. I just didn't want to cover the bottom of the head after it was on, because it would be a little bit too hard to cover. So just creating a rounder look for the head to sit on. Now, this next few steps, I do go pretty fast on my explanation for a couple of reasons. One, if you're planning on making this cake, you probably have the ability to sculpt to a certain extent, right? You have the ability to replicate what you're seeing. To do a tutorial of exactly how to sculpt, exactly how to make a face look like a face would take much longer than the length that this video is going to be. So I want to show you how I made it, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. So for this cake, I'm using chocolate cake. I'm just stacking my 6-inch round cakes, and I'm using cookies and cream buttercream, which is my son's favorite. I did not do a simple syrup for this particular cake. This is a How to Cake It Yolanda's chocolate recipe. But I just feel like my cakes are moist enough, and with the buttercream, it's just perfect. So if you wanted to, you could do simple syrup. I just wouldn't recommend doing a whole lot of it, because again, you want your cake to be tasty and delicious, but also sturdy enough to sustain being a sculpted cake. And I will also stay away from fruity fillings, because things start getting, again, runny, and it can make your cake a little bit more moist than you want it to. If you notice here, I'm scaling back a tad every time I put a new layer, because Gekko's head does have a little bit of a backwards, upwards direction, and you're gonna see towards the end. That's why they're very tall heads, and then at the very top, kind of domes. So I do end up using a dome cake for the top, and I didn't cut in half that last piece, because I'm going to sculpt it, and it's going to reduce in size. So again, look at your reference, which is what I'm doing. Always, when touching edible, ready to eat food, always wear your gloves. And I am just little by little, piece at a time, sculpting the head and giving it as much as I can that final shape, because yes, you can mostly fix things with chocolate, but chocolate, it's a modeling chocolate, that is, it's a very expensive product, and you want to be efficient with using it. So the better you are at sculpting and making your cake do most of the look for you, the more efficient you're going to be at utilizing those ingredients. And that goes for fondant too. You want to make sure that your sculpting of the cake does the majority of the look for you. That doesn't take away that, of course, if you have a particular area that's giving you a hard time, of course, utilize your resources to make it work for you. So just try to, as you get more comfortable in doing these cakes, just try to make your ingredients work for you. Now, again, I'm measuring, making sure my head doesn't look too tall. Mine did at a point. If you see there, it's kind of like round but flat to the sides. And I am also anticipating that I'm going to have to add a little bit of chocolate to cover that gap between the bottom of the head that we did prior, which is at scale. It's perfect. But also the missing cake. I did not want to add cake pop. You can if you want. The cake pop is just pieces of cake mixed with a little bit of ganache or a little bit of buttercream and add it on. You can if you want. I did not want to. I didn't want to have that. I did also put a little bit of a sideways cut towards the front where my eyes were going to be positioned. Again, trying to make the cake work in my favor with having the facial or the face structure as close as possible to the actual final look. And I didn't quite show you all the ganache detail, but you add the ganache to the final cake and it makes it where you have a nice soft surface. So in here, so in here, I'm adding little pieces. Like I mentioned, I want to make sure that I have a nice transition. Again, not only is the head what's actual cake, but it also is sort of like the focal point, right? It's bigger. Again, it's based on the cartoon. So cartoons tend to have, bigger heads, bigger eyes. So important to have, if anything needs to be detailed and very expressive, it's the head, at least for this particular project. So I added the pieces that I needed individually so that I could make sure that everything looks seamless in terms of proportion. It went, piece by piece, but now I moved on to an actual full-on coverage. So if you've never worked with modeling chocolate before, it's just like fondant in the sense that you can work it out where you spread it out and stretch it with a rolling pin, and then you can just cover your surface. In this case, I wasn't too worried about the lumps that you see here. I did go back and took my hands and worked it out, but you can see that I made space for the eyeballs, and this is where it kind of jumps right into the actual face. Again, I did not go into details for the face. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments down below. This is a true to the toy scale, and you can even look at pictures and get a reference from that. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I had a lot of fun making this cake for my son for his 5th birthday. These characters are very popular today, and again, you can use this exact same structure and make any character you want. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.